very eyes of Her Royal Highness, Princess Margaret!
Made news. She made news.
But fortunately, Kensington Palace isn't far away.
Margaret and the Earl of Snowdon.
Elizabeth and Princess Margaret
Above all, she could see he made her sister happy.
And in recent years, Princess Margaret has been...
Of that day soon became troubled.
Alice decided to give him an earldom, and hence...
long official tour she'd undertaken on...
Well, this private individual, this...
And Princess Margaret didn't have those things to think about, so carved a different path through life.
Pathetic, but urged the lovers to wait, hoping that time would work its own solution.
Petitioned Parliament for permission to marry.
Her royal duties to her country.
I'm glad to have the opportunity.
As an enigma.
Half of her you're talking about, the royal half, or the...
I can remember being...
Margaret was a leader of fashion.
to herself in her moping in her room at Clarence House, playing sad records.
My mind is full of the wonderful scenery.
Princess Margaret finds a warm welcome in the little town of Degunwy. 11-year-old Heather Jones has her own big moment with the princess.
But as we know, she did not. As she grew into maturity, she emerged from the royal shadow of her sister, the Queen, as that impossible thing.
Princess Margaret visited the site of a new colliery at Cotgrave for the black diamond that she'd cut herself and received a silk.
And for the kind references you have made
Of her high station. Between the princess and her grandmother, there is a close link. Surely a sufficient answer to the few who it takes daily a greater share of the...
And seen from her, here you are on the one hand, so there was this kind of...
She would always insist on her
nightclubs, the 400 and the Embassy Club.
And she was believed to be one of the last to see him. The press avidly discussed the world's most eligible bachelor girl and her...
The princess would have lost nothing except her place in the line of succession, because he wanted to go off travelling the world, but if he was in London, he should pop in for the truth behind the matter, that they were no she could be, in contrast to the stories of how difficult she could be.
This perhaps is how she would like to be remembered, Venus, or guarantee her love. At 16, she made her first public appearance on her own. It went...
And to all the citizens of this great city, I would say thank you.
Go riding with her older sister, and still lows. Days later, it was plain that the princess was still suffering test. But of her family and their retinue of solemn...
Riding than to Tobago.
Made a joint statement, carefully couched to suggest that a new man had entered her life. What do you call a journalist who's married to... drawn together by a powerful...
Personal tragedy, health issues, overall bad luck. Here's the final years of Margaret's life. In 1960, everything seemed to be going swimmingly. For a while, the two were at the centre of London's high society. They rubbed shoulders with musicians, attended film premieres and concerts, and by all accounts were the most sought-after hosts throwing the most coveted parties in town. Despite all of the glamour, behind the scenes, Margaret's union to Armstrong-Jones began to come apart at the seams. Reportedly resulted in her family planting a bug in her room to keep tabs on her. As Princess Margaret revealed, took a significant turn for the worse. While smoking was common back then, the princess's choice of smokes were Chesterfield's cigarettes. However, due in part to her habits, Margaret developed laryngitis, pneumonia, and bronchitis throughout her life. Such a history of health issues plagued with heavy smoking and drinking caught up with Princess Margaret by the 1990s. Maintaining her partying ways and causing a bit of an uproar among the British public while doing so. And she first started feeling off, and her head was hurting, according to the New York Times. Her headaches were followed by dizziness, and then by pains in her chest. She was transported to a hospital in nearby. She seriously scalded her feet getting into a hot bath. The news was confirmed by a palace spokesperson who told the press the incident and what truly happened have remained unanswered. That Margaret was not considered a critical case. After receiving the all-clear from doctors, Margaret was allowed to travel back to her home in Kensington Palace. A statement from palace officials released at the time read, "The impacts of the third stroke certainly showed themselves with time. Margaret's function on her left side was impacted by her third stroke energy that she was so often known for. Instead, she was rarely spotted in public and relied on the use of a wheelchair." But in early 2002, the princess suffered yet another stroke. This time with very little room. Newspapers had jumped on the Margaret health bandwagon, reporting that her isolation from public royal life due to complications of a stroke on February 9, 2002. A statement from the Buckingham Palace read, "Her close friends, however, were having none of that and came out swinging to defend the princess, or by calling 1-800-273-TALK 8255.
And insiders and experts discuss the glamour and excesses for all the wrong reasons.
There's a lot of criticism.
Escape from the shadow, but she was also escaping. Back home, Margaret's marriage to Tony Armstrong-Jones, or Lord Snowdon as he was also known, had broken down. He'd had numerous affairs, and Margaret needed to get away from London and from him.
Making much of the breakdown in the Snowdons' marriage.
Her sister, Queen Elizabeth, had reached the
part of Princess Margaret's social circle.
But when she first visited, back in the early 60s, Princess Margaret's love affair with Mystique started in 1960. She first visited the island during her honeymoon tour of the Caribbean with her husband.
It is not only a delight, but a sort of miracle to arrive 5,000 miles from England and find oneself instantly and absolutely at home.
In those days, the royals Anya.
She was very familiar with all those and really liked her and kind of understood her.
Mystique, in the early days, was very different to the other Caribbean stops on the royal tour.
When spoiled she was, well, she certainly wasn't spoiled when she first came to Mystique.
I think the challenge of it all.
Princess Margaret fell in love with the tiny island of Mystique, but her husband didn't.
Tony didn't greatly care.
That was really the only time he ever went there.
As Margaret left the little island that she'd fallen in love with, she had no idea when she'd be back. By the summer of 1968, Princess Margaret's marriage to Tony was going through a rocky patch. Rumours were less involved in Margaret's royal duties.
It was said that their life together, fiery relationship, they fight a lot.
She was like a pressure cooker. She needed some kind of a safety valve, and it suddenly...
And soon, the princess realised that her new house could be the perfect place to invite her gentlemen friends.
It was a very discreet...
She'd been rejected, effectively, by Tony, and she didn't like it.
One of the...
For too long, that would cause trouble. Margaret's special hideaway, not just from her royal duties, but from her marriage too, which was now in serious trouble.
She was very angry.
But it wasn't just Lord Snowdon who was having affairs. The princess now was seeking solace of her own outside the relationship, and word had reached the palace.
And once the press realised that they would sell more newspapers if they wrote
of press intrusion into the royal family.
In 4 centuries, it was a bruising time for Princess Margaret.
She had lost public support because I think people were quite horrified by the Roddy Llewellyn affair. So,
once again, Margaret, the Queen's visit to Mystique, Margaret's divorce from Lord Snowdon was finalised. It was a significant moment in royal history.
The Queen's...
If Margaret thought her divorce would draw a line under things, she was wrong. The public and press remained hostile, and soon they were baying for blood.
So you could present it very much as her neglecting her duties.
Over the next 10 years, Margaret's royal duties reduced significantly, and just 2 years later, Princess Margaret died.
Draped in her own blue and crimson standard, Princess Margaret's coffin leaves the King Edward VII Hospital late this afternoon.
Her ashes were placed in a tomb with her father, King George VI. It had been a life well lived, and Princess Margaret's time on Mystique had scaled the highest highs and touched some of the lowest lows.
I think, look, the heartache that brought her and the rest of the royal family, and of course some of her health issues.
There's little doubt Princess Margaret's life on Mystique did much to change the perception of royalty in the 20th century.
But then she also opened up the royal family to the kind of